version of what you just heard in Italian. I teach in America and I teach college in the US, so I'm used to be speaking in English, especially when I have to talk about history and about theater. So I was talking about the impact of Greek tragedy in American theater, and I was telling how much the Greek theater itself, classic Greek theater, finds an interesting spot in American theater, because it's not really that popular. The idea of classic theater in the American world corresponds and translates into Shakespeare. So whenever they put up a production of Shakespeare, that's what is considered classic theater. When I come to Italy, I see, and I come back home, or when we come to Europe, we see that we have a broader span of what we consider classic theater. And maybe because Greek theater is just around the corner from us, we consider Greek theater as part of the classics. Greek theater, unfortunately, doesn't see a lot of productions, in particularly on Broadway. But it is quite popular in the academia, and in the US, most academias, most colleges and universities have a department of theater where you can actually graduate in acting, directing, and theater history. And because of that, we also have theaters in the universities and in colleges. So at that point, productions of classic Greek theater happen quite a lot in academic theater. On Broadway, and when we talk about being on Broadway and Broadway theaters, we talk about theaters that have more than 500 seats, and those Broadway venues are located in New York City. They're more looking for commercial theater. As a matter of fact, if you take a look at the production that are on Broadway, in the big theaters on Broadway, you see that 80% of those productions are musicals, which are more appealing to the general audience. Off-Broadway venues, which are smaller theaters, and those theaters can sit anywhere between 150 and 500 seats, they tend to have more room for experimental theater, for a little bit riskier productions, and that's exactly where you would find Greek theater when it's produced in New York City. Just to give you an idea, the most recent production of a Greek tragedy that I have seen in New York City, and I'm fairly up to date when it comes to theater, it's a production of Bacchae, directed by Anne Bogart, and it was off Broadway. Broadway houses are not having a theater production of a Greek play since 1986, I believe. And that production was a production of Oedipus, 1984, a production of Oedipus the King, produced by the National Greek Theatre. And eventually it wasn't really that successful because it only stayed open for less than a month. Whereas there is an infamous production of Oedipus the King that took place in 1945 that was open for just one night. And that gives you an idea of how commercial theater works in relation to academic theater or non-profit theater. Broadway is the commercial venue for excellence. So when the moment the show isn't making any money, it is shut down regardless of the quality of the show, regardless if they had beautiful reviews, regardless of whatever the contracts of the actors and whoever is involved is like. So that is commercial theater. The Americans, though, are really, really fond of the myth and the mythology behind the Greek theater. One of the most successful musicals that is up in New York, that will be back up when theaters will reopen, is Hadestown. Hadestown, directed by Rachel Chavkin, has been inspired by Orpheus and Eurydice. And so that gives you an idea how much the myth itself is important. And then they rewrite it, they find things that could be a little different from what we are used to. As far as Oedipus is concerned, it's interesting how Oedipus itself has been considered a metaphor for the underdog, the metaphor for social injustice or racial issues. There are 3 or 4 adaptations of Oedipus that I'd like to mention. The most recent one is Oedipus El Rey by Luis Alfaro, a Latin American playwright. And in this adaptation, Oedipus is a Chicano, that is to say, a young Latino man who eventually gets in trouble with a gang, street gang in South California, and ends up in jail. So his livelihood and his trajectory as a character becomes the trajectory of a guy who is in trouble and has to get out of trouble. Probably the most successful adaptation of Oedipus the King is Godspell at Colonos, which is a musical, and it's a gospel musical, which was created by Tellson and Breuer in the 1983-1985. What's interesting about this was that they created analogy between the original text, Oedipus the King, and they put that text as part of preaching, so part of a ritual. So what's interesting about this is they revamped the ritualistic element of Greek theater, and the choir that is the choir of the church in Brooklyn where this production was conceived was used as the chorus of the Greek tragedy. So there is this kind of bridge. In fact, that was so clever that in 1985 this production was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for Drama. Finally, there is a third production I'd like to mention, which is the production, the play that is called The Dark Face of the Earth by Rita Dove. And this production play was written at the end of the 70s, so we're talking 1979. And it was about a slave and her child. So the child is Oedipus. So the child becomes the legitimate son of a plantation owner and of a slave. And they kind of kept the plot line pretty much faithful to the original. But of course, what's at stake, it's not just the horror of the reality of killing your father and beheading your mother, but it's the whole idea of that being overcharged with racial issues. And that's it. I'm pretty sure I didn't say just exactly the same thing as I said in Italian, so